Cody Harry Minanya, Kiwi Dakota Denethno. Hi, y'all. I just wanted to provide some updates and information prior to a meeting we'll be having coming up this month on the 17th regarding the enrollment for minors. So I figured that a video where folks can listen to it double speed or whatnot might be easier than having to read the legal briefs or the policy analysis. So I'm going to go ahead and provide that for you all here, okay? So the title of the paper is Revisiting the 5-Year Re-Enrollment Limitation for Minors in the PyramidLake Paiute Tribe, a Historic, Legal, and Policy Analysis. Just a little background. This has become an issue that I've become passionate about and started to look into it for our people, and I've realized that it's affected a lot of other folks and families and will affect many future generations. So I took it upon myself to do the work along with others. So please bear with me, and I hope you take the time to listen to the video and become informed before the Tribal Council meeting on the 17th in a couple weeks. So this paper argues for the removal of the PyramidLake Paiute Tribe's 5-year re-enrollment limitation on minors. This policy restricts individuals who relinquish membership as minors to a narrow 5-year window after turning 18. After age 23, they are permanently barred from full membership, regardless of their connection to the community. Drawing on historical, legal, decolonial, economic, public health, and neurodevelopmental perspectives, this analysis finds that the rule is a colonial era relic misaligned with Numa values and detrimental to the tribe's future. A background review traces the policy's origins to U.S. federal Indian law policies that impose restrictive enrollment practices on tribes. In the broader context of federal Indian law and past U.S. policies, tribal enrollment criteria were often designed to reduce Native populations. Today, however, law and policy strongly affirms tribal sovereignty to define membership. The paper examines how the 5-year rule affects the PyramidLake Paiute community, estimating that even if only a small percentage of our roughly 3,000 enrolled members are directly impacted, this still translates to dozens of individuals and families excluded as tribal members. It highlights a case study of a young professional excluded from re-enrollment, illustrating the economic, healthcare, and social harms of the rule. Importantly, a 2004 constitutional amendment restoring the Tribal Council's full authority over enrollment without federal approval is detailed, underscoring the removal of the rule as legally feasible and sound. Ultimately, the findings show that eliminating the 5-year ban would reinforce tribal sovereignty, self-determination, improve community well-being, and align identity practices with Numu traditions of inclusion. The paper concludes that abolishing the 5-year re-enrollment limitation is a necessary act of self-determination to ensure the tribe's cultural continuity and thriving future. Introduction. Federal Indian law has profoundly shaped how tribes define their own membership. From the late 19th century onward, U.S. laws and administrative practices encouraged tribes to adopt restrictive enrollment criteria that's alien to indigenous traditions. The allotment area, 1880s to 1830s, introduced the concept of quote-unquote blood quantum, quantified Native identity in fractional terms to determine land allotment eligibility. This racialized approach to belonging laid the groundwork for the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, also known as the IRA, under which many tribes, including the PyramidLake Paiute tribe, adopted written constitutions with defined membership rules. Often these IRA area rules, drafted from the BIA with BIA oversight, incorporated minimum blood quantum or base rule requirements. Racial blood quantum standards became entrenched. During the termination era, 1950s to 60s, federal policy explicitly aimed to dissolve tribes and assimilate Native people, terminating over 100 tribal governments and compelling many individuals to relocate to urban areas. In this climate, some tribes tightened membership rolls to protect dwindling communities, while others lost federal recognition entirely until restoration in later decades. By the self-determination era defined as the 1970s to present, tribes increasingly recognize that these colonial enrollment laws, like blood quantum and other restrictions, which I will specifically focus, the 5-year limitation, were undermining their futures. For example, leaders of the Grand Ronde tribe recently warned that the federally imposed blood quantum rule in their constitution, if left unchanged, would eventually self-terminate the tribe by shrinking its population. Against this historical backdrop, many Native nations are reconsidering membership laws that originated in U.S. policy rather than in indigenous practice. One such policy now under scrutiny is the PyramidLake Paiute tribe's 5-year re-enrollment limitation on minors. This rule prohibits former members from rejoining the tribe after 5 years from turning 18 years old, with their membership being relinquished as minors. This paper examines the 5-year rule in context, analyzing its historic origins, legal basis, and impacts through multiple lenses, including federal Indian law, decolonialization theory, traditional Numa governance principles, public health, economics, and neurodevelopmental considerations. It argues that removing the 5-year re-enrollment ban for minors is both legally permissible and critical to the tribe's cultural and economic success. In doing so, the analysis highlights how U.S. Indian policy influenced tribal enrollment laws across Indian country, how the rule arose within Pyramid Lake's own history, and why recent changes in tribal governance now empowers the tribe to alter its enrollment policies in accordance with self-determination. A case study is presented to illustrate the rules, human impact, and policy recommendations. Policy recommendations are offered for abolishing the 5-year limitation and fostering inclusive membership. The goal is a formal, multidisciplinary argument for reforming a relic of colonial policy in favor of Indigenous values and for the tribe's strategic interests. So I'm going to next go to the background of this 5-year rule. The Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe's 5-year rule refers to the time frame a minor can re-enroll after turning 18 years old. This means the individual was once a Pyramid Lake member, but then disenrolled prior to 18 years old, and now has until 23 years old to return, or else they are permanently barred from re-enrollment. To trace its origin, one must understand the tribe's enrollment history. Under the original 1936 IRA Constitution, membership was defined broadly. All persons of Paiute blood whose names appeared on the 1935 base roll and all children born to resident member parents were eligible for enrollment. The founding documents did not explicitly address issues of relinquishment or dual enrollment, leaving such matters to be handled by tribal ordinance, with approval of the Secretary of Interior. In the decades that followed, as intertribal mobility increased and some individuals qualified for multiple tribes, Pyramid Lake, like many tribes, faced this question about dual enrollment, meaning membership in more than one tribe. The process was formless for former members to return. The 5-year re-enrollment ban appears to have been adopted around 2006 in the tribe's enrollment ordinance as a mechanism to allow minors 5 years to make a so-called informed decision regarding one's desired tribal belonging. Additionally, the policy is consistent with model codes promoted by the BIA in earlier eras to discourage individuals from frequently switching tribal affiliations. For example, the San Juan Southern Paiute Tribes Enrollment Ordinance, enacted in 1997, requires that, quote, at least 5 years have passed since the date of relinquishment or disenrollment, unquote, before a person may be reinstated to membership. Pyramid Lake's rule likely originated from a similar template. aiming to deter citizens from changing tribal citizenship on a whim or for economic favor. Under the policy, if a Pyramid Lake Paiute miner relinquished the membership, often a prerequisite to enroll to another tribe, since nearly all tribes, including the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe, prohibit dual enrollment, that person had 5 years after turning 18 to rejoin the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe. In theory, this limitation was meant to give the miners some time to quote-unquote mature, as well as discourage opportunistic enrollment changes. In practice, though, it appears some individuals who relinquished as minors have still been barred by the letter of the 5-year rule, a point of growing community concern. The policy of Pyramid Lake's Paiute 5-year rule, as contained in the tribe's enrollment law, has been described in tribal documents along these lines. Quote, any person whose membership was relinquished while the person was a minor child is eligible to reapply for membership within 5 years after turning 18 years of age. If he or she received judgment or per capita as a member of another tribe, colony, or band prior to filing the application, or prior to tribal council approving their application, such person will be eligible for membership purposes only. This essentially codifies a 5-year limit for rejoining the tribe. It is difficult to quantify exactly how many people have been affected by this policy over the time, but the impact is not trivial. The Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe today has approximately 3,014 enrolled members as of May 2024. Even if a small percent of each generation relinquished membership, often due to complex family, tribal ties, educational, financial opportunity, and later wish to return, over the decades, the total number of individuals touched by the 5-year bar could be in the dozens, if not hundreds. Each such individual represents a relative kept outside the community for years, and often possibly their whole family lineage could be affected by this exclusion. Community anecdotes recall members who left to enroll in a parent's tribe as a child and later as adults found themselves unable to reconnect with their Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe due to the 5-year limitation. These stories have fueled calls to re-examine the rule. Notably, a recent change to the tribe's governance has opened the door to reform. In 2024, the Pyramid Lake Paiute people approved an amendment to the Constitution to allow the Tribal Council to modify enrollment policies without the approval of the Secretary of Interior. This amendment, ratified July 15, 2024, added language to Article 2, membership, of the Constitution stating that, quote, the Council shall have the power to propose ordinances governing future membership and the adoption of members by the tribe, provided that no existing property rights shall be affected. In effect, the tribe reclaimed the full authority over membership criteria, strengthening self-governance by reinforcing the requirement for federal oversight of enrollment changes. This development means that the 5-year rule can now be amended or abolished by the tribe's own legislative action alone, a significant step towards self-determination in defining citizenry. So, moving on, legal analysis, federal Indian law, and membership determination. Federal Indian law strongly supports the tribe's authority to remove or amend the 5-year rule. In the federal landmark case, Santa Clara Pueblo versus Martinez, 1978, the U.S. Supreme Court affirmed the question of tribal membership as the core of tribal sovereignty and generally beyond the reach of federal courts under the Civil Rights Act. The court recognized a tribe's right to, quote, define its own membership for tribal purposes, recognized as central to existence as an independent political community. In other words, the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe has the inherent sovereign power to determine who belongs to it, including the power to change or eliminate conditions on re-enrollment. No federal statute prohibits the tribe from abolishing the 5-year limitation. On the contrary, Congress and courts have repeatedly deferred to tribes on membership decisions as a matter of self-governance. The Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968 imposes certain constraints on tribal governments, parentheses, ensuring rights analogous to the Bill of Rights, close parentheses, but it provides no federal forum to litigate membership disputes. This means that any reform of membership criteria must come from within the tribe's own law and political process. Fortunately, the legal framework for such internal reform is straightforward. Tribal constitutions and codes, especially those adopted under the IRA, typically include mechanisms for amendments or for the tribal council to enact ordinances on membership. Prior to 2024, PyramidLake's IRA era constitution required that most changes to membership rules receive not only tribal approval, but also approval by the Secretary of Interior. Today, however, the tribe's new constitutional amendment has removed that federal approval requirement for membership ordinances. This enhancement of sovereignty means that the tribal council can amend the enrollment ordinance or policy by council resolution or tribal vote without needing the secretarial election for each change. The U.S. Department of Interior's current policy is generally to defer to tribal determinants of membership. As the Department of Interior has stated, quote, each tribe determines whether an individual is eligible for membership, unquote. And the BIA is rarely involved in enrollment matters. Thus, if the tribe decides to eliminate the 5-year ban, there is no legal barrier at the federal level to do so. Indeed, it would be an exercise of the tribe's right to sovereignty and self-determination. Contemporary federal law and policy actually favor tribes' self-correction of membership laws that no longer serve the tribe's best interest. Even foundational membership provisions, once influenced by federal officials, can be revisited by tribes. Notably, some IRA area tribes that initially imposed strict blood quantum requirements have since amended their constitution to expand membership definitions. Parentheses, for example, moving to lineal descent in lieu of fractional blood requirements, unquote. In the same vein, the PyramidLake Paiute tribe can amend or repeal its 5-year re-enrollment rule through its own governance process. In doing so, it would be perfectly in line with the principles of federal Indian law, which hold that membership is an internal tribal matter. Federal trust obligation likewise support its maximizing its citizenry. The United States is an interest in the stability and the continuity of tribal communities, and nothing in federal law would undercut a tribal decision to welcome back former members without an arbitrary delay. In summary, from a legal standpoint, the tribe is on solid ground to reform or abolish the 5-year rule. Such a change would reinforce the bedrock principle recognized in William v. Lee that in 1959 that tribes have the right to make their own laws and to be ruled by them, far from inviting legal challenge. Removing the 5-year re-enrollment limitation would exemplify lawful self-governance in action, consistent with tribal sovereignty and support federal policy deference. Moving on to a decolonial perspective, which I think is quite important. Numu concepts of belonging. Well, legal authority is clear. The deeper impetus for changing the 5-year rule comes from a decolonial critique. The rule as it stands embodies a colonial mindset inconsistent with indigenous governance principles. Traditional Numu society did not conceive of membership in the rigid, exclusionary terms imposed by Euro-American law. Historically, Northern Paiute people lived in regional bands tied by kinship and geography, and individuals or families moved freely among these bands. Identity was fluid and inclusive. One's belonging was affirmed by kin relations, mutual responsibilities, and residence, rather than bureaucratic enrollment status or punitive time frame limitations. In pre-colonial context, if a Paiute person or family left one's community, for instance, to join a relative elsewhere or marry into another band and later return, they would not have had 5 years to return. Kinship networks and reciprocity were foundations of governance, meaning that those who fulfilled obligations to the community were accepted as members of it. In contrast, the 5-year re-enrollment ban on minors reflects a value alien to Numa culture, a notion of citizenship that is a revocable privilege that one can lose with passage of time. This colonial notion comes directly from colonial concepts of citizenships and jurisdiction. Euro-American governments have historically used such measures to control identity and allegiance. For example, early U.S. policies stripped Native individuals of their status or treaty rights if they left the reservation or became citizens of another nation or state. Imposing a years-long limitation on former members is a policy logic that literally mirrors banishment in colonial law, rather than rehabilitation and inclusion emphasized in indigenous law. Indigenous scholars note that strict blood quantum rules and related membership restrictions were originally designed to erode Native populations and are fundamental tools of assimilation. By this logic, any rule that arbitrarily restricts who can belong, such as permanently restricting a relative to becoming a tribal member after a time frame, such as the 5-year rule, ultimately serves the long-term goal of indigenous erasure of identity. It also is telling that such restrictions did not originate from Numa traditions. They were adopted under external pressure and perceived necessities of modern governance, as defined by a colonial system. A decolonization analysis would ask whether the 5-year rule truly protects the tribe or actually harms it by mimicking the exclusionary practices of colonial governments. The potential harm evident when considering community cohesion, the potential harm becomes evident when considering community cohesion and cultural continuity. The 5-year limit creates a form of social alienation. Individuals who earnestly desired to return to the tribe, often to be with family, to live on their ancestral land, or to access tribal services, are told they are not welcome back as members. This contravenes the indigenous ethos of belonging. In Nama oral traditions and values, people speak of coming home, to Pyramid Lake, to the lake. The lake and land are central to our identity and spirituality. This is the place where our creation stories come from. Consider that. To place a procedural benefit on coming home undermines the cultural concept. In practice, this rule likely discourages some disenrolled members or relinquished members from ever returning, especially youth who were removed due to parental decisions and then lost their connection due to time frame. Such outcomes benefit no one. From a decolonial perspective, membership policies should center indigenous definitions of identity, not colonial ones. Many tribes today are reevaluating their membership criteria with an eye toward traditional inclusiveness. For instance, some Pueblo nations have revived practices of adoption and naturalization for those who fill community rules, regardless of blood quantum. The PyramidLake Paiute tribe can also draw on its heritage of kin-based belonging as it reforms its laws. In traditional Numa governance, what mattered was who participated in and who was claimed by the community. As one native scholar put it, Native identity is not so much about who you claim, it's about who claims you. If former members sincerely seek to be claimed again by the tribe, then the colonial-era rule should not stand in their way. Eliminating the 5-year rule would be an act of decolonization of the tribe's governance. It would strip away an arbitrary colonial construct and replace it with a practice more consistent with Numa values of inclusion, relationality, reciprocity, and kinship. Such a change affirms that citizenship in the tribe is a relationship grounded in mutual responsibility and kinship, not a punishment or reward to be withheld. In making this reform, Pyramid Lake would join a broader indigenous movement to undo a legacy of imposed enrollment policies and reform and refocus on sustaining the peoples for generations to come. In sum, from a cultural standpoint, removing the 5-year restriction is a step towards healing and restoring indigenous norms of belonging. It repudiates the notion that tribes should police its boundaries in the same manner that the colonial governments would, and it instead embraces the notion that once a Numa, always a Numa, even if one's path home was prolonged. Moving on. Neurodevelopmental policy analysis. The scientific case against the 5-year rule. As a medical doctor, this was one of my strongest arguments and critiques of the 5-year rule. Why 5 years? Why not 2 years? Why not 1 year? Why not 100 years? So let me get into that now. The 5-year re-enrollment limitation assumes that by age 23, an individual possesses full cognitive maturity and capacity to make an informed, irreversible decision about their tribal identity. However, modern neuroscience strongly contradicts this assumption. Research in neurodevelopmental studies demonstrates that the prefrontal cortex, an area that governs decision making, impulse control, and long term planning, continues to develop well into the person's late 20s, 30s. We're not even sure yet. Studies in developmental psychology also indicate that individuals refine their self identity and capacity for complex decision making well beyond the age of 23. Tribal governance policies should align with both scientific understanding and traditional indigenous values, which have historically recognized that identity is fluid and relational rather than transactional. Policies relying on rigid timelines risk unjustly excluding individuals who need more time to navigate their tribal identity. Instead of enforcing an arbitrary 5-year limitation, the PyramidLake Paiute tribe should adopt a more inclusive and flexible approach that acknowledges the evolving nature of identity. By incorporating neurodevelopmental insights into enrollment policy, the PyramidLake Paiute tribe can reform its commitment to holistic community well-being, aligning governance with both modern scientific research and traditional Numa values. The next area to look at is public health and economics of restrictive enrollment. Beyond the principles of law and culture, the 5-year rule carries tangible consequences for the tribe's health and economic well-being. Restrictive enrollment policies can inflict real harm both on individuals and on communities' capacity to thrive. Membership status also impacts mental and emotional health. The sense of being excluded from one's people can contribute to psychological stress, depression, and identity struggles, particularly among the young and young adults. Native youth who are not enrolled, often due to stringent blood quantum rules or current enrollment policies beyond their control, have been described by some advocates as paperless Indians, ineligible for many benefits and sometimes struggling profoundly with their sense of belonging. This marginalized group has been linked to higher risk of self-harm. Indeed, suicide is the leading cause of death among American Indians and Alaska Native youth, and loss of culture is a known risk. A 5-year limitation on re-enrollment for minors further keeps individuals from their people, which can exacerbate identity disconnections. From a community health standpoint, every member who desires reintegration should be welcomed back as promptly as possible to rebuild their support networks and identity within the tribe. Doing so can improve mental health outcomes for the individual and reinforce intergenerational ties that are protective for the youth. In short, the sooner former members are re-enrolled, the better for their well-being and, by extension, the health of the community. The economic ramifications for restrictive enrollment are also significant. Tribal economies benefit from robust and engaged citizenry. Each individual represents human capital: a worker, a professional, an entrepreneur, a student, a cultural knowledge keeper, one who can contribute to the tribe's development. Reducing the number of active members through onerous rules can restrain the tribe's workforce and talent pool. If someone is unable to enroll, they may live and work elsewhere, investing their skills outside the community. Conversely, enabling re-enrollment could encourage former members to return, bringing back valuable skills, labor, and economic activity. For example, a young professional who left Pyramid Lake to enroll in another tribe might have a change of heart and wish to come home to start a business or serve in tribal administration, an opportunity that would benefit the tribe's economy. But a 5 year exclusion would derail this person's return. Another consideration is funding and resources. Many federal and state allocations to tribes, for example, housing, education, healthcare, etc., are based on the number of enrolled members or the resident service um, or resident services. These are based on population. Thus, maintaining a larger enrollment population can increase Pyramid Lake's share of grant funding and program resources. While each person is kept off the roll by the 5 year rule might translate to marginal decreases in funding that could have been used for the community's benefit. Over time, these add up. In broader economic terms, inclusive membership is a strategy for long-term stability. Uh, Folks who study demographics have warned that the tribes who strictly limit tribal enrollment, whether through high blood quantum requirements or rules like time frame limitations for enrollment, risk demographic decline. By contrast, tribes with growing populations can leverage economies in federal advocacy, parentheses, a larger population can mean a stronger political voice, close parentheses. In developing tribal businesses, parentheses, a larger citizenry creates a larger internal market and workforce. Indeed, there is concern across Indian country that if current restrictive enrollment trends continue, some indigenous nations could essentially self-dissolve through shrinking numbers, fulfilling the old assimilationist goal by default. This is precisely the scenario Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe must guard against. By removing the 5 year barrier and welcoming back those who wish to return, the tribe can immediately boost its membership through reinstatements and send a powerful message that it values all its descendants and all former members. This may in turn encourage those living off reservation or children of former members to reconnect and contribute to the community. Re-enfranchising former members strengthens family networks and reinforces the tribe's human capital base. In summary, the 5 year re-enrollment rule directly affects not only a subset of individuals at any given time, it represents a broader philosophy with clear public health and economic downsides. Eliminating this rule would strengthen the workforce, increase the tribe's economics, eligibility for external funds, and enhance social cohesion. Each of these outcomes aligns with the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe's interests in thriving as a community. Simply put, the rules cost a measure in the tribe's health and wealth, far outweigh any speculative benefits it was intended to provide, meaning the 5 year rule. Case study. I wanted to provide a case study to provide very human and tangible impacts of what this 5 year rule can do. And this is true. And to humanize the impact of this 5 year rule, one can look at the experience of a Pyramid Lake Paiute tribal member we'll call Dr. A, name change for privacy. Dr. A is a medical doctor who grew up connected to Pyramid Lake, but due to unique circumstances, found himself outside the tribe's enrollment. As a child, Dr. A was originally enrolled with the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe. However, when he was 17, he was enrolled in another tribe in which he had ancestral ties. Not uncommon situation for families with multi-tribal heritage, might you note. In order to do so, they had to relinquish their Pyramid Lake tribal membership as dual enrollment is prohibited. Years later, after completing college, medical school, and training, Dr. A wants to come back and serve the Pyramid Lake community, but both because of personal identity and out of desire to improve local health care, he wants to return. To his dismay, he learned that the 5 year re-enrollment rule barred him from re-joining his people forever. Although all cases are not as dramatic as this medical doctor who was affected by the 5-year limitation on re-enrollment, it shows how excluding even one capable, willing tribal member have outsized repercussions in a small community. This case study is a microcosm of why reforming this policy is urgent. Indigenous communities experience some of the highest rates of chronic disease in the United States, including diabetes, heart disease, mental health struggles, and substance abuse. These disparities are exacerbated by limited access to culturally competent healthcare providers, a strong predictor of improved health outcomes in Indigenous populations. Research consistently demonstrates that Indigenous patients achieve better health outcomes when they are treated by Indigenous providers, especially Indigenous providers who come from those communities and understand those cultural norms. Tribal doctors play a critical role in fostering patient trust and adherence to treatment plans, directly contributing to reduced morbidity and mortality rates. They also improve long-term health within the community. When an Indigenous doctor is prevented from re-enrolling due to outdated policy, the entire tribal community loses access to vital healthcare resources. The 5-year rule does not protect the tribe. Instead, it actively harms its ability to develop a self-sufficient healthcare system. Beyond healthcare, the economics of a medical professional, especially a medical doctor, within the tribal community is substantial. Research in rural and Indigenous economics show that a single practicing physician strengthens local economies in multiple ways. Some say multiple millions of dollars by creating funding for local clinics through insurance reimbursements, funding federal health programs, job creations, hiring healthcare support staff, increasing clinical workers, helping with administrative personnel, economic stabilities for families, reducing the financial burden of travel, of having to seek medical care. The list goes on and on. So consider these when we talk about this 5-year ban. So moving into the policy recommendations for reform, and there are four of them. There are four of them. The first recommendation is initiate legislative change. Determine the appropriate legal mechanism to abolish and amend the rule. Now that Article 2 of the Constitution has been amended in 2024 to empower the Tribal Council to enact membership ordinances without secretarial approval, the Council can directly revise the enrollment ordinance by resolution. The Council should draft an ordinance amendment repealing the 5-year limitation on re-enrollment of a minor. The revised law would simply state that any person who has relinquished membership or who was disenrolled as a minor may reapply for membership at any time without any time restrictions, providing they meet all eligible other criteria, including up for discussion of getting money from other tribes and resources. But that's not the focus of my assessment here. The stipulation if the individual, okay, here I go on. The stipulation on if the individual received per capita or judgments from another tribe is maybe necessary to safeguard against truly capricious behavior. For example, the tribe could stipulate that individual who relinquishes and re-enrolls multiple times may be subject to case-by-case review, but the blanket prohibition for 5 years should be removed. The second policy recommendation for reform: implement an outreach and transition plan. Once this rule is removed, the tribe should be prepared to welcome back those who were affected. The enrollment office may receive a wave of applications from individuals who have been waiting or previously discouraged by the rule. A streamlined process for reinstatement should be established. For example, the tribe can create a short re-enrollment form for former members requiring only basic documentation of prior membership, which tribal record should have, and proof of relinquishment from the other tribe if applicable. At the same time, tribal departments, health clinics, education, housing should be alerted that new enrollees may be coming so they can plan for any modest uptick in service demand. Overall, the message should be clear. The tribe is ready to re-embrace its people back and support their reintegration. The third policy recommendation: monitor and address any changes. After implementation, it will be important to monitor an outcome and address any concerns that arise. Some community members might initiate worry that easier re-enrollment could encourage people to treat membership lightly or could restrain tribal resources. The Tribal Council and Enrollment Committee can respond by tracking members of re-enrollment and evaluating their impacts. These narratives and data should be shared with the community to reinforce support. Pyramid Lake's experience can also be shared with other tribes considering similar reforms, positioning a tribe as a leader in a progressive, people-centered enrollment policy tribe. The next recommendation is conduct a holistic membership policy review. Finally, the tribe should view the removal of the 5-year rule as part of a larger effort to modernize and decolonize its membership laws. It would be timely to convene a membership task force or working group to review all aspects of enrollment criteria, such as blood quantum requirements currently in the Constitution, which some Pyramid Lake members have noted may lead, which some Pyramid Lake leaders have noted may need to be revisited to avoid phasing out future generations. The same community dialogue and sovereignty-centered approach used to build consensus for eliminating the re-enrollment time limitation can be applied and evaluated towards a shift toward lineal descent, if those steps would better secure the tribe's future. By addressing these issues comprehensively, the tribe can craft a membership policy that honors cultural concepts of kinship and belonging, maximizing the citizenship membership policy that honors cultural concepts of kinship and belonging, maximizing the citizenship population, and thus the community's strength and access to resources, and still maintaining appropriate standards reflecting the tribe's values. In essence, removing the 5-year re-enrollment limitation for minors can be the first step in a series of positive, self-determining, affirming membership reforms for the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribes. So, conclusion. The Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe's 5-year re-enrollment limitation for minors is a relic of an era of when outside forces heavily influence Indigenous identity laws. Today, armed both with wisdom gained from historical reflection and newly secured authority over our own membership rules, the tribe can choose a different path, one more aligned with cultural ethos and its strategic needs. Legally, the tribe is unquestionably empowered to change the rule, thanks to the bedrock principle of tribal sovereignty over membership. Morally and culturally, the tribe's colonial underpinnings clash with the Numa tradition of kinship and inclusion, making its removal an act of decolonization and community healing. Practically, eliminating the 5-year limitation on re-enrollment of minors stands to improve healthcare access, increase the tribe's population, resource base, and strengthen family and community bonds among the Pyramid Lake Paiute people. By moving to strike down this rule, tribal leaders would affirm that being Numa is not a revocable status subject to paperwork purgatory, but rather a lifelong identity, one that can always be reclaimed through the welcoming of one's people. The policy change recommended here is modest in scope. It lifts a specific procedural hurdle, the 5-year rule, but is profound in significance. It sends a clear message that the tribe will not continue any practice that aligns with colonial systems over Indigenous values, especially when the practice harms the tribe's future generations. Instead, the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe is asserting its own approach to law, one that favors belonging over exclusion and restoration over punishment. In doing so, the tribe will strengthen its cultural continuity and community resilience. In the final analysis, Removing a 5-year re-enrollment limitation is not simply about increasing the membership roll. It's about reaffirming the tribe's cultural, legal, and economic sovereignty. It is an exercise of self-determination at the most fundamental level, deciding who is Numa on our own terms. Such a decision is both necessary and just. The PyramidLake Paiute tribe has the opportunity to ensure that its doors remain open to its people, whenever they choose to come home.